said this video is going to be about is about tritone substitution. So G7, I can substitute a very plain D flat or C sharp 7, maybe even D flat 13 in place of G, and especially if the bass player plays a G. So here's my bass player. You can probably hear how this sounds like a very altered G7 chord. In fact, the 13th of the D flat 7 is the sharp 9 of G. The E flat, which is the 9th of D flat, is the flat 13th of G. The C flat in the D flat chord is the flatted 7th, but it's the 3rd of G7. The F, that's the 3rd of D flat 7, is the 7th of G7. And the D flat, the root of the D flat 7 chord, is the flatted 5th or the sharp 11th of the G chord. So I get a sharp 9, and if I just put a normal 5 on my D flat 7 chord, I get a flat 9. So it's pretty easy to get both. Sharp 9, flat 13, sharp 11. It's kind of an exploded G7. It's got every alteration that's available to me in that chord. Flat 9, sharp 11, and flat 13, if I just play D flat 7 kinds of sounds. So after the D minor 7 chord, sorry, I put the A flat in the wrong place. I could shift my thinking to start thinking of D flat dominant 7th sounds, and I'm gonna do the same thing I did on the B flat 7 chord and play the D flat bebop scale, which has the major 7th added to it. And in this scale fingering, I would probably go for this one right here. Oops, sorry. So you could think of it as this G flat major scale. That's the one I call scale fingering number 2. Some people would think of it as the A flat Dorian fingering. But I very rarely think modally, so I never think of that as the A flat Dorian mode. I always think of it as this note's key signature, G flat. In this case, it's got 6 flat. So you could also think of it as its inverse. It's only got 1 natural, it's F natural, and everything else is flatted. So I'm thinking of it as the key of 6 flats, and that gives me, G flat major, but also D flat 7 and A flat minor and all these other parts of the key that I might want to think of. So out of this G flat major scale or this D flat dominant 7th scale, I'm gonna play D minor 7 flat 5. That was just down the D Locrian scale, or the key of 3 flats starting on D. And then here's the G7 chord. I'm gonna play D flat 7, the D flat 7 bebop scale. And I've ended on the flat 9. I left out the major 7th at the end there. Let me do that again. Here's G7, flat 9, flat 13 chord. Kind of cool to end on the G, or to put a G in there somewhere else. That really brings out the sound of it as a G scale rather than as a D flat scale. So here's G7, D flat bebop, D flat 7 bebop scale. Throw that G in there, you're really going to hear it as a G sounding scale. There's other places you can start. Starting on the 3rd or the 7th of the D flat is kind of a cool spot to start from, and it's gonna if you play a string of 8th notes, you'll end on the same pitch that you started with, an octave up or down. And then because the 3rd and the 7th of the D flat chord become the 7th of the 3rd and the 3rd of the G7 chord, you're starting on notes that are good to think of as D flat, but also perfect to think of as G flat 7. If you start on the root of the D flat 7, you're starting on the sharp 11 of the chord of the moment, right? You're playing a G7 chord. And so you're starting on the sharp 11, which is kind of a spicy note to start with. So you could also start on the 7th of the chord. And you're gonna end on the 7th that I played, if that was a whole measure of 2 measures of 8th notes, or 1 measure of 16th notes or something. I'm starting and ending on a good note, both for G7 and for G7. Or you could start on the 3rd of the D flat 7, which is the 7th of the G7. And if I did it for 1 octave, so if you looking really carefully, you caught me playing a different pattern, but the same note. So ignore that one of those examples because I changed finger patterns. But that is D flat dominant 7th bebop scale over G7. So that is the sound of the tritone substitute of the G7 on that altered chord. And resolves very nicely to some sort of very nicely to C minor 7. So let me see if I can play through it slowly. This is going to be D minor 7 flat 5 with the D Locrian scale, or the key of 3 flats going from D to D. So that's what I'll play on the D minor 7 flat 5 chord, and then I'll play a G7 chord. I'll play D flat 7 bebop scale, which is the tritone sub of G7, and then I'll play some C minor. And I'll do this in kind of a freeze frame style so I can play the chords so you can hear in the background. So here's D minor 7 flat 5. Here's G7. And I threw some G's in there as well. And here's C minor. Oh, I lost my pick. So there it is, the sound of tritone substitution with a couple of excursions into other areas. But that is the sound of a tritone sub on a G7 or on any altered 7 chord, and really great in a minor 2/5. And if you map out your scale fingering so that you've got your key that you're starting from, and then your tritone sub, you can hear it's kind of dramatic when you hear it in that way, where I put the D minor 7 flat 5 and then D flat 7 and free of context of the actual chords in the background, that will tend to sound a little strange. But here's my pick. Oh, I lost it again. But I dropped my pick into the piano. If you play it in context with the chords in the background, there's a lot of little paths that you can carve through those chord changes, and it gives you really just a couple of different notes, but it really changes your thinking quite a bit, and it gives you a new way to access some of those great sounds, and hopefully they're there right under your fingers.